Born Linda Laura Burfield in 1867, she was the oldest of seven children in a small town in Carver County, Minnesota. Her mother, Susanna Neal, was a devout Christian, and her father, Montgomery Burfield, was a Civil War veteran and farmer. The family's life was simple, but it seems Linda, from the very beginning, had grander ambitions. Her path to becoming Dr. Linda Laura Hazzard was an unconventional one. Without the benefit of a medical degree, she managed to navigate a loophole in Washington state's medical laws, allowing her to practice what she called fasting therapy. This was her Bible. She believed that by starving the body, she could cure a multitude of ailments. Fasting for the Cure of Disease was the name of her book. Her methods were controversial, to say the least. By the time she opened her sanitarium, the Wilderness Heights, in 1908, she had already built a reputation as a maverick healer. Wilderness Heights sat surrounded by dense Washington forests. It was here that Linda Laura Hazzard would treat her patients, prescribing weeks, sometimes months, of absolute to near starvation. She believed by depriving the body of food, she could purge it of all sickness. Or did she? But the truth behind the Wilderness Heights' gleaming facade was far from a tale of a miraculous cure. It was a story of manipulation, greed, and for some, a slow march toward the grave. Some say she was a visionary ahead of her time, others, a cold blooded serial killer. The line between healer and predator grew increasingly blurred as her practice gained notoriety. Patients, often desperate for relief, would arrive, lured by her promises of a revolutionary treatment that could cure everything from obesity to cancer. Hazard's methods were extreme, but they were also incredibly effective at one thing: draining her patients of their life savings. Her treatments were very expensive. Her marriage to Samuel C. Hazzard was as rocky as her medical career. Samuel, a West Point graduate with a penchant for alcohol and deceit, had a history of swindling. Their union in 1903 was tainted by scandal, as it was revealed that he was already married. In 1908, the first whispers of trouble reached the public's ears. A patient at Wilderness Heights had died under Hazzard's strict fasting regimen. Clara Williamson. Hazzard was unshaken. She took to the local newspaper, the Seattle Sunday Times, to defend herself in a full-page article titled, "Why I Believe in Starvation as a Cure for All Body Ills." In the article, Hazzard claimed that her methods had just been misunderstood, that the deaths were not a result of starvation, but rather the body's natural cleansing process. It sometimes went wrong, as it was purging itself. She boasted of a near perfect track record, saying, "In each of these cases, it is my absolute conviction that their days were prolonged by my methods. Only 9 patients have passed away in my 11 years of practice." Now let's shift a minute to a pair of sisters, Claire and Dora Williamson. Wealthy English heiresses, Claire and Dora, stumbled upon Hazzard's ad during a trip to Victoria, British Columbia in 1910. They were in their 30s, and for some reason, they felt they were in desperate need for relief of their ailments, and they were intrigued by the promise of a natural cure. Well, they would get one. It just might not cure what they actually wanted it to cure. Against the advice of their family and friends, they reached out to Hazzard, eager to try her fasting therapy. But she had other plans instead of Wilderness Heights. She suggested they stay in the city in Seattle, just temporarily. It was quite a contrast to the retreat they had imagined. But the sisters, hopeful and desperate, agreed to the arrangement. They began their treatment 2 cups of broth per day, accompanied by rigorous exercise and painful massages. As the days stretched into weeks, their health deteriorated dramatically, yet Hazzard remained steadfast in her convictions. Their letters home grew increasingly alarming. Pleas for more food were met with a stern reassurance that their health was improving. Just hang in there. But it was clear, even to them, that something was very wrong. But for some reason, they stayed. Claire and Dora were too weak to walk. They were moved on stretchers to an ambulance, then by boat. There, They stayed in an attic room of Hazzard's home where she could keep a very close eye on them. 17 days after their arrival at Buena Vista, Claire Williamson took her last breath, her body a mere skeletal frame that once held a vibrant woman. She was laid to rest in a small, unassuming grave, a tragic testament to the faith she had placed in the controversial healer. But her ailments were gone. Linda Hazzard, ever the composed professional, conducted the autopsy herself. In her meticulous notes, she recorded Claire's condition, yet she insisted starvation was not the culprit. Margaret Conway had been the sister's childhood nurse. When she heard of what had happened, she traveled from the other side of the world. Upon her arrival at Buena Vista, she was met with the heart-wrenching sight of Dora's lifeless body, barely recognizable at 50 pounds. Her shock and disbelief grew to anger as she learned of what had been happening. Linda Hazzard and her husband demanded that before Dora leave that she pay extremely high fees, a staggering $2,000, which is equivalent to almost $50,000 today, for the treatment that had killed her sister. The story took a dramatic turn with the involvement of British Vice Consul Lucien Agassiz. It's hard to say. He was a man of honor and compassion. He stepped in upon hearing of Dora's plight. He secured her release from Hazzard's clutches and initiated a legal battle that would send shockwaves through the community. Many headlines at the time included newspaper clippings with bold, damning headlines like "Starvation Sect Exposed" and "Fasting Frenzy Leads to Tragedy." The investigation into Claire Williamson's death was swift and thorough. Hazzard's practices were scrutinized under the harsh glare of the public. Her self-assurance began to crack under the weight of the accusations. On February 7, 1912, Linda Hazzard was sentenced to 2 to 20 years in the Washington State Penitentiary for manslaughter. Her supporters were outraged, and letters began to flood in from her devoted followers begging for her release. There was even a petition that had 121 signatures, each a testament to the sway she held over her devoted following. She was at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, and in December 1913, Linda Hazzard walked through those gates a convicted woman. But she never truly lost her sense of self-righteousness. In her autobiography, she wrote of her time in the penitentiary as a sacrifice for humanity's ignorance. For Dora Williamson, the nightmare was far from over. After her sister's death, she found solace in the arms of an old family friend, Reverend Wyndham Allen Chaplin. They married May 7, 1914, believing that together they could start fresh. Dora and her new husband hoped to find peace and healing. Their marriage was a brief interlude of joy, which was quite a relief from the tragedy that she had just left. But fate had one final cruel twist in store. On August 1914, Reverend Chaplin drowned only a few months after his marriage to Dora. Her world shattered once more. Dora was left to face the harsh reality of life without her husband or her sister. But what happened to Linda Laura Hazzard, the disgraced doctor? Her time in the Washington State Penitentiary did little to settle down her convictions. If anything, it seemed to bolster her resolve. She was released on parole on December 26, 1915, after serving just 2 years. She emerged from the fortress with a steely determination to reclaim her title as the pioneer of health. With her reputation in tatters, Linda Laura Hazzard looked to the distant shores of New Zealand for a fresh start. Here, she and her husband Samuel Hazzard managed to build a new life far from the prying eyes of the American justice system. But in 1920, she returned to the lush landscape of Washington State. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, she reopened her sanitarium again. This time, she called it the School of Health. It was a clever play on words, a way to bypass the legal restrictions that had been placed on her after the tragedies. Some claimed she had indeed cured them. Others talked about the horrors that took place within the walls, yet she continued to supervise fasts, insisting that her methods were just misunderstood. On September 10th, 1935, the sanitarium burned to the ground in a fire that seemed almost fateful in its timing. Some say it was divine intervention, maybe judgment. Others that it was a desperate act of a woman who had lost everything. It was never rebuilt. Ironically, Linda Laura Hazzard would meet her end in the very manner that she had prescribed for so many others. Her body, once robust and healthy, was now a mere wisp of its former self. She was found in her home June 24th, 1938. Her attempt to use her own medical treatments to cure herself of an illness resulted in her death. She was then buried at the Queen Anne Columbarium in Seattle, King County, Washington. But her legacy did not die with her. Her treatments had claimed at least 15 lives, some say many more, their stories etched into time. I leave you with this. It's a final chapter of a doomed life of one of the victims of Linda. Now, why these people didn't just leave is beyond me. On March 28, 1910, Earl Edward Erdman, a civil engineer with the city of Seattle, took his last breath in the very hospital that should have been his salvation. His storyline, like so many others, is one of hope and despair. His diary, a heartbreaking account of his ordeal, and it lays witness to the truth of Hazzard's twisted therapy.
February 1st, saw Dr. Hazzard and began treatment this date. No breakfast. February 27th, ate 1.5 cups of tomato broth for breakfast. No other food. February 28th, no entry. March 1st through March 5th, a blur of orange slices and tomato soup. This diet continued more or less unchanged until his hospitalization on March 28th. He died that afternoon, just before his co-worker was to transfuse blood.
Has been a haunting exploration of the darker side of medical history. Just one of millions of stories across the world. It's a tale of greed, deception, wrapped in the disguise of health and salvation. When will we learn? Probably never. Now go grab yourself a sandwich, and we will see you next time.